In the summer of 2020, sustained activism by chapters of the Movement for Black Lives reached new heights across the country. One can argue that without these events, the momentum to address the harm caused to Black communities whose neighborhoods were destroyed by highways would not exist today. Torn apart by Memorial Highway in the 1960s, the Lincoln Corridor in New Rochelle is one such example.
So the Lincoln Corridor is defined locally as between Webster Avenue East to about North Avenue. You'll see that horrible circle in the middle of the street. That's Memorial Highway that kind of cut the community in pieces. We're just kind of a strange little community surrounded by wealthier communities.
The stories shared by community advocates we had the privilege to work with illuminated just what was deeply broken and lost, and urgently needs to be acknowledged and meaningfully repaired. The cycle explaining why many Black communities in America have had no choice but to build resilience while fighting a steep uphill battle for equity is familiar to most. First, a sustained current of systemic oppression and anti-Black racism. Then, establishing thriving communities, building spaces and social infrastructure of self-sufficiency, only to be collectively pushed several steps back by actors in a system adept at using policy, design, and the built environment as central tools of exclusion. How has this cycle played out in the case of the Lincoln Corridor, and in what ways can urbanists intervene alongside communities? To better understand this, we need to step back in time and hear from the advocates themselves as well.
Home is everything, man. It's my building block. So my home made me, New Rochelle. That's where I'm from, where I grew up. It molded me, shaped me to the man I am today.
Before what would become America's Settler Colonial Project, the Sinoway, members of the Wapinga Confederacy, stewarded the land we know as New Rochelle. Like other Native communities of the Americas, contact with European settlers resulted in land disposition, death, and dispersal of remaining communities. Traditionally, the dominant collective narrative centers the Huguenots who fled to the French West Indies to escape religious persecution, eventually arriving in New Amsterdam and ultimately settling in New Rochelle. An important part of the story that is often glossed over or completely erased is that among the first non-native arrivals to New Rochelle were 40 enslaved Africans who formed the foundation of one of America's oldest Black communities, a community that predated the Revolutionary War by nearly 100 years. That fact alone underscores a sentiment shared by Leslie, one of the advocates.
I want there to be Black people, thriving Black communities in New Rochelle. I don't want us to be a footnote in a Wikipedia page because we've been here since the inception.
In 1798, a little over 100 years after their arrival, New York State passed the first of several manumission laws. These laws freed enslaved people who were not of working age, the very young, under 4 years, and the very old, over 50 years, and compensated enslavers. The following year, Hannah Pugsley, an enslaved Black woman of working age, was freed without any conditions. Her enslaver, Hannah Pugsley, a Quaker woman and the last of the white Pugsleys, was also still alive. Being freed without any conditions while the enslaver was still living was an extremely rare occurrence. The historic Black neighborhood of Pugsley Hollow, located near what is modern-day downtown New Rochelle, was named after her. While the Black community's numbers in New Rochelle ebbed and flowed, they established social institutions that stood the test of time, including churches, schools, social clubs, and businesses. These establishments would become the fabric of the Lincoln Corridor, the central spiritual, social, and economic hub of Black New Rochelle for decades. Many of the advocates we worked with either shared their own memories of the corridor or those shared by their loved ones.
The Black community would have these big dances and annual galas.
In 1841, prominent members of the Black community, Charles Pugsley, Abraham Benet Jr., Isaac Eldridge, and Richard Smith founded the first AME Zion Church on property they purchased on Harrison Street. This church remains a cornerstone of the Lincoln Avenue corridor. In 1898, Wynyah Avenue Elementary School was built. In 1905, Black children would be allowed to attend the school, which would later be renamed Lincoln Avenue Elementary School, and be at the center of one of the nation's most important desegregation cases. An important institution in the vibrant social fabric was in part made possible by the New Rochelle Co-op Business League, which sold stocks to finance its lending and development programs in 1908. They built League Hall, a gathering space for the Black community at the intersection of Winyah and Brook Streets. Faith institutions also continued to be central to the community. St. Catherine's, formerly known as AME Zion, purchased land and built a church on Winyah Avenue. Shiloh Baptist was another Black faith institution that would co-locate on Winyah Avenue. In the early 1900s, during the Great Migration, more than 6 million Black people moved from rural areas of the South to the urban areas in the North in search of economic opportunity. Black migrants also arrived from the Caribbean. In New Rochelle specifically, the Black population tripled, buoying social and economic institutions. The migrants brought with them food traditions that would later be termed soul food during the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s, as well as other social traditions. Many of the advocates trace their family roots in New Rochelle to this time period. Others' ancestors arrived long before. While the community continued to grow and build strong institutions, they suffered setbacks that would help to chart the course for the destruction of the Lincoln Avenue corridor and usher in the divide embodied by Memorial Highway. In 1938, Lincoln Avenue and City Park, another Black enclave, were redlined, and Pugsley Hollow was designated as declining in yellow and commercial in gray. These decisions would have lasting impacts on the Black community, paving the way for the eventual destruction of the Lincoln Corridor. In 1948, Winyah Avenue was finally renamed Lincoln Avenue, shedding its connection to a Confederate transplant from South Carolina, a figure who stood in direct opposition to the Black progress, resilience, and joy embodied by the Lincoln Avenue corridor. A retired social worker and current community advocate, Walter, describes his experience of the Lincoln Avenue corridor prior to Memorial Highway very fondly, saying,
"It was a place to me where a child could be in the neighborhood and every adult basically looked over that child. You just felt like a neighborhood child. I guess that's the best way to put it."
Community advocate and leader of the Grow Lincoln Park Community Garden, Linda remembers her family's contribution to this vibrancy.
Everybody knew my family because our store, my dad, when he retired from Arnold Baker's, he opened up a community store on Lincoln Avenue.
In the same year, 3 municipal housing projects were built, originally intended for returning World War II veterans and their families. Peter Bracy in Pugsley Hollow, Hartley House on Lincoln Avenue, and McLee near City Park. These buildings have been home for many Black families in New Rochelle. They are also reminders of the impact of planning, design, and policy decisions on community members and the tenuous standing of public goods as privatization of public and affordable housing continues. Kwame, an advocate whose engagement focuses on improving the community through PTSA leadership and holding the police force accountable, recalled,
"My mother, brother, and sister, they all moved over to the other side of Angela's complex, Bracy Apartments. That was one of the examples I was saying. Living in projects, which was 30% of your income, they qualified to live there. But then when the new development came, all of a sudden they wasn't qualified for the new development, so they had to relocate to the other side of town. They were sad because it was the side that we grew up on. So now, although we interacted and had family members on that other side, it's just not the same."
Attacks on the progress made by the Black community would continue, with particularly deep and sustained wounds in the realm of education. In 1949, Lincoln School parents charged the Board of Education with segregating the elementary school by allowing white children to transfer to other New Rochelle neighborhood schools. Unbeknownst to them, they would be fighting education segregation for years to come. Along with the Lincoln School charge, other cracks foreshadowing the coming schism and destruction of the corridor by Memorial Highway started to appear. Between 1954 and 55, white flight from Rochelle Heights and Rochelle Park began after rumors of the state plans to build the New England Thruway. In 1960, that fear came to fruition. 300 homes, apartments, houses, warehouses, stores, and churches, as well as 250 graves, were removed to make room to build the highway. On the site of the historic Black community of Pugsley Hollow, the Westchester Terminal Plaza and Cedar Street redevelopment project also moved forward. When it was completed, it was a Macy's shopping center. Eventually, it became the site of New Rock City, another shopping center and luxury housing, including Trump Tower. Many New Rochellians enjoyed the amenities available at New Rock City, but were not taught the history of these hallowed grounds. In 1964, the cracks became a gash when the school board chose destruction over integration. The Lincoln School was demolished. Students were bused to other schools outside of their neighborhood. There hasn't been a public school in the Lincoln Avenue community since.
My mom was one of the first group of students to be bused when they did busing.
The Lincoln School was a flashpoint in a much larger education inequity problem linked to desegregation not done well. Many students are still bused to other schools.
The way the school district handles integration is basically the kids and the families that live in the Lincoln district are bussed out to different schools to make them integrated. And those are the unintended equity issues that happened with this big push to desegregate.
That same year, plans were finalized for Memorial Highway, covering a route that affected 47 owner families plus 18 tenant families and 22 individuals, with no plans for supported relocation.
Memorial Highway in New Rochelle. Back in the 60s, it was filled with Black home ownership. New York State decided to come through, uproot everybody to make what they call a highway to nowhere. The highway literally connects to nothing, nowhere.
In 1967, Memorial Highway was completed, marking the end of a vibrant era of the Lincoln Corridor. The direct and indirect impacts of splitting the neighborhood were far-reaching. No longer would you have a mixed-class Black community with business owners, doctors, care workers, and others living, working, shopping, worshiping, playing, and fellowshipping together. Instead, many of these social, spiritual, and economic ties were spatially distributed, and in some cases they were lost altogether, disintegrating the fabric of the community. The story of the Lincoln Corridor did not end with Memorial Highway, but its centrality as a thriving hub for the Black community was severely inhibited. It remains a Black community with enduring scars from the legacies of decades of harmful planning, design, and policy decisions. In recent years, the city of New Rochelle has been experiencing rapid growth. In the mid-2000s, the city put into action the Downtown Revitalization Plan, colloquially known as the DRI. Its goal was to encourage private development in the downtown area. A major component was a rezoning exercise to streamline development. Development pressures are now pushing against the Lincoln Avenue neighborhood. A major component of the DRI's plans for the corridor include the proposed Link, an infrastructure reuse project that would convert part of Memorial Highway into a Highline-esque series of green spaces, community programming, and resources. It is an alluring proposal with some legitimate community-oriented components. However, evidence from similar projects in other cities shows that they often result in displacement of the existing community by pricing many people out. It is not entirely too late to implement preemptive and protective policy, design, and planning strategies. The vicious cycle does not have to be repeated in the Lincoln Avenue corridor yet again. It is possible for it to be returned to the kind of community Durrett, another advocate, describes having experienced as a child.
In order for your community to thrive, your dollar should circulate your community something like 16, 18 times before it goes out of the community. Now your dollar's going straight out. It just was like the dismantling of the community, and that's the collateral damage.
During this studio, we engaged as a multidisciplinary team of students and in collaboration with the community. We first assembled a coherent compilation of the city's history and current physical attributes. Then we dug deeply into cultural archaeology and narrative via a series of project muses. And finally, we moved from citywide systems thinking to identifying and designing pilot explorations of key. And today, we will use this final review space to pilot how we will eventually share our studio findings in an outward public forum through a physical and moving exhibition in New Rochelle. With that, we present our takes on the second question we opened this journey with. Rooted in a deep understanding of history, community memory, and storytelling, how can urbanists intervene alongside the community to imagine and build a future Lincoln Avenue corridor where Black New Rochellians thrive?